I grew up kind of in a sheltered home. It was me, my brother, and my sister. Never really was allowed to go outside unless I had one of them with me or my mom with me because it was not the best neighborhood. Everything was going really, really good. I was playing with one of my friends, and my brother called me inside. Something happened to Cassie. My sister was struck by a car. I got to the hospital for about 3-4 hours. My mom wouldn't let me see my sister. They were all going in to see her. We were praying for her. Next day, I went to go sleep at my grandmother's house, and I woke up to just my grandma just sobbing. And my brother came in around 6:37, and he was like, "Cassie passed." So at that moment is when I just kind of lost it. When she passed away, I felt like a piece of me died with it. I started getting really depressed, just heartbroken. There's no other way to explain it. It's like that pit in your stomach that just won't go away. And after that, it was like, you know what? Like, if there is a God, I'm gonna do everything I can to just push him away. I'm gonna go. I mean, if I need to go smoke crack, I will. You know what I mean? If I need to go party and do everything that I can fit in my nose, I will. You know what I mean? It just got to that point where it was retaliation. It was just bitterness. Like I felt this hate for God, which just sounds really bad, but for the longest time I was like, God, why me? Finally, I was sitting down one day, and every single frustration and pain I've ever felt, depression, everything, anger, the ball cracked and everything just got let loose. I didn't know what to feel. I was crying, I was upset, I was frustrated, I was angry. I mean, every single word of hate, like, put together in one sentence is what I was feeling at that exact moment. At that moment, I was kind of like, maybe I should pray about it. Maybe I should try something different, try something else, because everything else I've done never seemed to work. So finally I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna pray. I'm gonna ask God for peace. People keep saying about this peace that God's gonna give you. And finally I was like, you know what, like, Lord, just give me peace. This is what I need right now because I can't deal with this no more. I'm just sick and tired of life. Like, I wanna come home. I've never felt peace like that before. Asking for it and having it happen right at that exact moment, feeling that presence come over me, and no words could explain what I felt. And it was awesome. It was one of those things where I just sat there and I wanted to cry, not for the fact that I was depressed or I was sad, for the fact that I was happy, for the fact that I was just like, you know what, this is awesome. Like, where is this coming from? I want more. Can I buy this in a bottle? Ever since that moment, I mean, I've still had troubles. I've still had times where I fall on my face, but I always have the church, or I have God to pick me back up, you know what I mean?
Well, good morning, church, and welcome to Crossroads. My name is Kenny. I'm one of the pastors on our team. I'm excited to share from God's Word with you this morning as we continue in our series that we have been in the last several weeks called Uncommon Courage. And we've been looking at stories in the Bible that illustrate the kind of courage that you and I, as maybe followers of Christ, need to have in order to live life the way God has intended for us to. And so today, we're going to continue that series, and next week, we'll complete that series. And I'm going to share with you from the Old Testament a great story about a guy who was really very old and was an incredible military leader, and a guy who was really young and how God used him. And so you don't want to, it's going to be really cool to hear how we discover what God's plan is for our life next week. But how many of you, speaking of plans, have ever had a plan that didn't go according to the way you wanted? All right, I mean, that's all of us, if we're just honest with ourselves. It happened to me this week. I was trying to get back here. I had been on a mission trip and trying to get back here with my family, and the airlines apparently did not want to operate on my plan, or the ones that they actually charged me for, those plans either. But they decided that I should spend a couple extra days in an airport with 2 kids under 2 and no luggage. That was fantastic birth control. I'm never having another kid, ever. I don't even be around your kids. I don't even like kids anymore. I'm just kidding. If my wife's watching, that's not true, honey. Whatever, 8 kids, that's whatever you wanted. It's fine. But we've all had plans that didn't go according to act. I mean, just unbelievable, right? Sometimes it's our boss, sometimes it's our spouse, sometimes it's our kid when you give them the option of where you want to go to dinner tonight, and it's McDonald's every time, right? Or whatever it is, we've all had plans that didn't go according to what we thought they should. And this isn't true just in families. This is true in business. And a lot of illustrations that I share with you are business related because that's been my background in education. But one of the things that I was looking at was some marketing plans. I want to share three of them that were just epic failures for these marketing campaigns. I want to show you this first one. This one it's an advertisement. It says, "Come a little closer," and you can't tell. These are train tracks, but if you can't tell the bottom there, it's an advertisement for a funeral home. So you can You'll get that maybe tomorrow. I don't know. The first service didn't get this one. It's a health and fitness club, and they have a free joining fee. It's really funny on this side of the room. This side, you guys will get there. It's good. All right, and then this was pretty good. So this is 2 different pages, right? This is the spine of a book, and it's obviously the girl sitting down having a great experience with her towel. She's having a great experience, and so I'm not actually even going to describe that to you. I'm going to let your mind wander. That was a very big epic fail. I was telling one of the other campuses the other day about a couple of months ago. This is a freebie. This wasn't in the first service either. But the Odessa magazine. There's a magazine here in Odessa, and they did a special on the church several months ago. The front page of the church the front page of the magazine was a picture of the church and the big glorious pond we have out front, right? You've seen it from the highway there. You can see the great pond out front. Well, when you opened it up, the backside was a constant advertiser. Every month it had been there, and it was this giant beer bottle with beer pouring out. So it looked like when you opened the spine of the deal, that beer was filling our pond. Some of you will be like, really? I'm going to go check that out. No, don't do it. Don't do it. Pastors always say, you should be as excited on Sunday morning as you are on Saturday at the football game. I always say, if you want that, you should serve beer. That's terrible. I'm going to get in trouble for that later. It's all good, though. The point of reason to tell you all that, we don't get to decide the plan, right? We don't get to decide how people respond to marketing campaigns. We discover it. And the same is true in our relationship with Christ. The same is true in our relationship with God. We don't get to decide God's plan for our life. We discover it. A couple of months ago, I started drinking coffee. I was told many times as I started to have children the things in my life that would change, and most of the time people were wrong because I'm a different person than they are. But one thing they got right was coffee. Suddenly, I began to drink coffee. And about 2 months ago, I started drinking black coffee. I crossed over the bridge of actual manhood. There's hair on my chest. I can show you. But I'm like a real man now, you know? And so I was drinking this black coffee, and I started thinking, where did this come from? Who started drinking coffee? And so I was reading about 1000 A.D., these Arab traders brought this coffee from Africa, and they would pour this water and create this drink called kiawa, which meant that which prevents sleep, which is true. Also, they called it child, right? But they had this coffee, and so then in the 30s, you fast forward to the 1930s, and this German physician named Max Gerson began promoting daily coffee enemas to detoxify the liver, stimulate metabolism, and cure cancer. This is where Folgers got their slogan. The best part of waking up is coffee in your cup, right? You guys won't get that till next week either, but that was really funny. That was really good. But there's this global phenomenon, right? You drink a Starbucks coffee, and it's 9.5 cans of Coke in a caffeine content, right? And when you think about coffee, it takes 37 gallons of water to make 1 cup of coffee. And so these are things that I didn't get to pick out. These are things I didn't get to decide. These are things that I had to discover. And so when we look at the scope of God's plan for our life, we don't get to decide it. We discover it. And sometimes we have problems with that. Sometimes we don't like what we find as we discover God's plan. There was a prophet in the Old Testament named Habakkuk. The reality is nobody really knows how to say his name, poor guy. And he wrote this little book in the Old Testament. And he was a temple musician. But when you Google him or Google and look at Wikipedia, right? The first line in Wikipedia about Habakkuk is, nothing is known about Habakkuk. There's really not a lot of background on his life. The guy wrote this book in the Bible, and we don't know much about him. I don't know. I've been in church all of my life. I'm not sure I've ever even heard a message on this guy. And so a couple of months ago, Griff said, hey, I want you to teach on Habakkuk. And I was like, is that in the Bible? Right. And so I started reading and studying, and I was telling Griff earlier, I almost said, Griff, can I teach on like another Old Testament prophet, one that people have heard of? And God began to speak to me and began to teach me. And so this morning, I just want to teach myself, and you guys are welcome to listen in on what I learned from studying this book and the fantastic principles that God instructed through me for this little book, this little known book in the Old Testament called Habakkuk. And so it's written just before the Babylonian Empire had seceded from the Persian Empire, and it was right around the 7th century. And Habakkuk is a prophet to the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel has disobeyed God, and they've done bad things. Okay, and that's kind of why there's prophets. And so one of the things that he writes in his book that you may sound familiar to you is this phrase: the righteous will live by faith, or the just will live by faith. That maybe sound familiar to you. You maybe have read it in the New Testament. It's repeated several times, sprinkled throughout the New Testament in Hebrews and Galatians, in Romans, and that is that you can find that in Habakkuk chapter 2. And so he's actually a little more famous than perhaps we thought. But the book is a dialogue between God and this particular prophet, some courageous, honest conversation. He had the courage to be honest with God. So maybe you don't think you can be honest with God. Maybe you don't think you have the courage. But can I tell you, Habakkuk had that same choice, and he chose to be honest with God. He chose to be honest with God about the hard time that he was having with the plan that God had laid out. And that's what we're going to look at today. But when we discover the heart of Habakkuk's message, we find that he had the courage to live by faith, even when God seemed distant, even when God seemed silent. And it's a call, his book, the whole summary of his book, you can jot this down on the top of your notes, is this: it's a call to live out what we believe. And it can be challenging to live out what we believe, right? Because sometimes we want to be sincere about things. But have you ever been sincerely wrong? Habakkuk was really wrong in not in questioning God, but when he didn't believe God had the best plan for his life and for the nation of Israel. Okay, he was frustrated with God's plan. We're going to talk about what that plan was, but he was frustrated with God's plan. Well, as he goes through his life, he was very sincere that God had the wrong plan. You've been sincere that God had the wrong plan? I was reading a story about a little boy. His name was Jimmy, and he was looking for $1. His mom had given him $1 for ice cream, and he was looking under the streetlight for this $1, and he was looking everywhere. And finally, a man walked up, and he saw him sitting there, standing and looking all over the ground. He got on his hands and knees, and he said, "I'll help you, son. We'll find this $1." So he's looking all over the ground for this $1. And after a while, the man says to Jimmy, "Son, where is your $1? It's not here anywhere. Are you sure this is where you dropped it?" He said, "No, I dropped it on that vacant lot over there, but there wasn't enough light to look, so I thought I'd look here." He was never going to find his $1. He was looking in the wrong spot, but he was sincere, right? He was sincere about his search for his $1. We can be sincere, but we can be sincerely wrong. And so this morning, I hope we'll discover that it's okay to question God. But we need to be sincere about following his plan for our life. So, why did Habakkuk write? What was he trying to discover? What was he trying to figure out? He was trying to figure this out. Why doesn't God seem fair? A question probably all of us at some point in our life have asked, right? Why doesn't God seem fair? You know, one day, those of you who are followers of Christ, you'll arrive at heaven. You'll start wandering around trying to figure things out. You're going to talk to certain people. There's probably people in heaven you're going to avoid, right? You may be sitting next to him. And one day you're going to see this guy, and his name's going to be Habakkuk. And he's going to have written a book in the Old Testament, and you will not have read it until you came today. And I'm going to give you a summary of it, and you're going to be able to have the conversation and not have to avoid him for the rest of eternity. So you're welcome, all right? Just an aside. So why was he was trying to write because he wanted to understand why God wasn't fair. So look at this in chapter 1. We're going to focus in chapter 2, but I want to give you a little context. He says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you don't listen. You don't cry. I cry out violence, but you don't save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong?" How many of us can look around in our world and see that, right? We can say that about our world, maybe even our country, maybe even our culture, maybe even our house. I don't know, but we say, "God, why are you allowing this to happen? This is so messed up." And so he goes through and he says, I don't understand your plan here, God, and frankly, I don't think I like it. You see, God had told him that the culture that had embraced the perversion of their bodies, the brokenness of their families, and the whatever I want attitude, right? I want it now. That was the culture that he was living in. God had told him, hey, somebody's going to come from the outside, this Babylonian empire. They're going to conquer you. They're going to destroy all the stuff you built, and then they're going to ship some of your people to a faraway land. And he says, "Wait a minute, God, I don't like that plan. That's not a good plan. I've got a better idea. Why don't you just use me? I'll stand up on a stool, tell everyone what you said, and they'll all listen." God said, "No, that's not the plan." And Habakkuk says, No, I want it to be the plan. I really want it to be the plan. How many of us have ever heard a plan we didn't like Realize we didn't have a choice. Then what do? When your kid says you want to go to McDonald's, right? What do? You complain about it. Oh, yeah. Some of you suck it up because you're smart. Others of you just complain, right? And that's what Habakkuk does, right? I identify with this. I complain. He says, he complains to God, God, you don't seem fair. Why? You don't seem to care, rather. You don't seem to care. Why don't you care about what's going on? Right? You ever said that to God? Or maybe not that. Maybe it isn't. You're not doing much when you could. God, you could literally snap, think, do whatever you do, and whatever the situation is will be fixed. But you're not doing that, and I don't like that. That's what he says. And he finishes, what God is doing doesn't seem fair. God, you're not being fair. You don't seem to care. You're not doing what you could. And so this prophet in the Old Testament that's little known feels the way many of us probably have in our life, right? Sometimes we make deals with God. God, if you do this, I'll do this. And then we do it. And then we're mad at God because he didn't do his end when he never signed up for it, right? You ever tried that in school? Hey, I'll give you this $2 for your lunch. And then you just take the person and they're like, no, I didn't agree to that. That's what we do to God. Like, no. God says, I didn't agree to that. And then we get mad at God for it. Right? And that's where Habakkuk is. This is literally where he is. This is literally, in chapter 1 of his book, this is literally how he feels. And this book, we don't really know the time frame, but it was written over a series of years. This isn't something that he sat down and wrote in like a couple of days. This is his life chronicle that he compressed into a really short book. And then we say it's not fair. But can I share this with you? We don't really want God to be fair. I mean, we think we do. But we really don't. Because you know what fair gets us. Fair, in the scope of God, as a result of sin entering the world, gets us eternal damnation in hell. That's fair. We don't want fair. Griff says every once in a while, our lead pastor says, fair ended in the garden. When sin entered the world, fair ended. But we want fairness. We want things to be fair. No, we really don't. Because fairness is pretty messed up. And it's pretty bad for you and I. We live in a state of grace from God. And so, I digress, but going back, this is where Habakkuk finds himself, and this is where many of us find ourselves. Committed believers, Habakkuk found himself expressing both questions and faith. We can express both questions and faith. We can question God and do it the right way. Remember, it's all about the heart. The Bible teaches us it's all about the heart. And so in chapter 1, he says, "O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment." He's talking about this Babylonian empire. He says, "O rock, you've ordained them to punish. These people are coming after us. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil," talking about the evil that is in his culture. He says, "You can't tolerate wrong." He says, "Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves?" He's frustrated with what's going on, and he's having a hard time with God's plan. And in the Bible, he's not the only one. David had a hard time with God's plan. He said, "God, why have you left me here all alone?" In the Psalms. Paul had a hard time with God's plan. "God, why don't you take this thing away from me?" We don't really know what it was. We think it probably was an eye thing in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "God, take this away," and God doesn't take it away. But here's what's key to understand in all three scenarios. In Paul's, in Habakkuk's, God responds every time. Every time God responds. And so Habakkuk is quite distraught over the way God is running the world. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get God's plan. And many of us perhaps have been there, right? This is an election year in America. And I don't know if you've heard on the TV, but it looks like we live in another country. Like I have seen, we've always seen on the news, you see like riots of people in other countries where they're throwing things and there's fire and there's large groups of people. And now we're looking at that on things that are happening like our country. And I'm like, whoa, that's nuts. It's pretty crazy, right? And here's the problem in election years. We have a tendency to deviate from our faith in Christ. Especially there's a certain generation, the generation that's supposed to be the spiritual elders in our church. Many of them tell us, younger folks, hey, if we don't have the right people in office, God's not going to be able to take care of things. We've got to get on board and make sure God gets the right people in office, as though it depended on us. Hey, can I encourage you, if you're in that generation, to stop scaring us children? Because God's got either way. It doesn't matter who wins an election. It doesn't matter who you want to win. It doesn't matter if there's a Christian in office or an atheist in office. What matters is that we're obedient to Christ. And I'm not telling you that those things aren't important and you shouldn't be involved. You should. Those are all good things. Do that. Be involved in politics and do all that. Make an influence. Make an impact where God leads you to make an impact. But can I encourage you to not tell everybody that God's plan is based on one person? God's plan for your life is based on you, and that's what we need to focus on. That's what Habakkuk focused on. That God's plan for him required obedience from him. And he didn't get to pick it out. He got to discover it. So let's look here at some really practical things I want you to jot down as we land the plane. He says, what do you do when you don't understand God's plan? What do we do when we don't understand God's plan? Say this election doesn't go the way you want it to. And that's going to be true for somebody in this room, right? Maybe a whole bunch of you. Everybody will be angry after the election, right? It's just how it works. But what do we do when things don't go our way? What do you do in your own life when God's allowing something in your world that you don't agree with, that you don't want to happen? When you look around and corruptness has invaded your school, when corruptness has invaded your workplace, when you see brokenness all over the place and you don't understand why people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, when God's not replacing those people and doing, what do you do? Habakkuk went through this journey himself in chapter 2, and we're going to look at a couple of verses. And the first thing he did was decide to listen. He decided to listen. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look and see what he will say to me, what God will say to him, and what answer I am to give to this complaint. In Habakkuk chapter 2. And so this is what he says. He says, I'm going to stay the course. I'm going to do what God has told me to do. I'm going to follow God every way that I know how, that he's revealed to me at this point, so that when I get to the end, I've been obedient with what at least I know. I can do what I know. Right? Victor was here, one of our missionaries in India. He said a couple of weeks ago, and said, listen, if you know one thing, do one thing. We know one thing, we should do one thing. Stay the course, stand our watch, and station myself on the ramparts. Now, this is really interesting. So a rampart, you may not know, that's an ancient word. This is a picture of a rampart. It's the part of a wall that's tall. And so you can stand on top of a rampart, and you can see for miles. You can see enemies approaching in days of yore, right? You could see giant clouds coming and storms about to come, or you could just see a great view of the countryside. And so if you go back in the chapter 2, he says, I station myself on the ramparts. He says, I'm going to put myself in a position to be able to hear from God. I'm not just going to listen, right? Sometimes that's what we do. We just want to wander through. I'm listening to God. I'm waiting for God to give me instruction on what's next in my life. But we're not putting ourselves in a position to be able to hear. It'd be like me saying, I'm waiting for my wife to tell me what's for dinner, but I won't answer the phone when she's calling. Right? I mean, that's ridiculous. But that's what we do with God. Well, God, I'm waiting to hear from God, but I'm not going to put myself in a position to be able to hear from you. And so that's what he says. He says, get on your rampart. He says, find your high place. Find the place where you can hear from God. You know, the modern day version of this is like those binocular looking things that they have this shape. And on top of buildings, right? Where, you look through them, you put like a quarter in, you can see out. Right? You guys do that? I mean, I don't do that. Because there's all sorts of germs on there. I ain't touching that. They don't clean those things. You kidding me? I ain't going with some eye disease. I'm sorry if that's your livelihood, but put some Clorox wipes next to it, and I'd be happy to contribute a quarter. But that's the modern day. You can see, right? You can use those, and you can see all out across. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, find your rampart. Find your place where you can hear from God. So I don't know what that means to you. Some people say, well, I hear from God when I'm at the lake, or I hear from God when I'm on a hunting trip. And yeah, those are good things. But if the only place that you can hear from God is 4 hours away at the lake, because we live in Odessa, all right? You need to move to the lake, because hearing from God is more important than whatever you have here. So I just want to encourage you, find your place. Whatever it is, find your rampart. Find the place where you need to hear from God and listen to what he has to say to you, because I believe God has a message for each and every person in the room. When we don't agree with God's plan, we don't understand, he wants to tell you about it. It's okay to ask questions, but at the same time, we apply faith. Mark Batterson is a pastor in Washington. He says this. He says, a change of pace and a change of place will result in a change of perspective. So not only is it important for us to listen, but secondly, it's important for us to write. Habakkuk chapter 2 says this. He says, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that the herald may run with it. Write down the revelation and make it plain so that the herald may run with it. It's important for us to write. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not a huge fan of writing. Like, I don't like to write down my inner thoughts. I don't like to journal. That's not who I am. But when I moved here several years ago, we were about 1,000 miles from anybody of blood relation. And so I thought somebody advised me at the time. They said, you should write down the things that God does during this time. And I thought, well, why would I do that? Of course I remember what God's going to do. But I took their advice. I made some notes on my Evernote. And as here we are 5 years later, I look back, I've made notes along the way. And you know what I've produced? I've produced a journal of what God has done in my life. When I feel discouraged, when I feel frustrated, when I can't get on board with what God's doing, I can go back and look and say, you know what? God's taken care of it when it was hard before. You don't have to get a pen and some flowery journal to take notes. Type it on your iPhone, put it in a file, and save it for later. And you'll stumble back on it at the most opportune times that will encourage you. So write it down. When you disagree with God's plan, when you're having a hard time accepting it, it's important to listen, God, but it's also important to write it down and remember. Remember what God has done. It's important to remember what God has done. That's why we write it down. In chapter 3, Habakkuk makes this journey. He gets to chapter 3 and he says his splendor was like the sunrise. He's talking about God. He says, rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. And then he says this, and this is the essence of verse 5. I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to read it for you. He says, the presence of God is so great that when God's not there, it's this bad. Plagues went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. When God's not around, it's a very dismal situation. You don't want to be there. It says he stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the mountains tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. He gets on board. He wrote these things down and looked back and said, oh, this is how great God is. I can remember now how great God is. I remember the great things that God has done when he created incredible sunrises and when he did all of these great things in my life. Habakkuk says, this is how I cope with it. You know, our church has been on a journey for a long time here at the Odessa location. We've been in this building for about 8.5 years or so. And when we moved out here with much less people, which I think that's right English, right? Many less people, whatever it is. Fewer people that are in here now, all right? In both of our services, we had two, and we didn't have very many people at all. And our lead pastor, Griff, at the time said, no, this is what we're going to do. We're going to move forward. Many of you made that journey along over the last several years, and some of you have joined along that journey. And there was an excitement. We're going to reach the community for Christ. But you know what happens is eventually people become complacent, right? We become complacent. And so when I look and I go to Monahans and Andrews and I see our locations there, they're growing by 30%. They're excited. We're baptizing for the first time today in Andrews. Very exciting. After the service, if you want to speed, don't speed to Andrews. Drive safely. They're going to baptize here in about 20 minutes or so for the first time at Andrews. It's really exciting. And so we look at what's happening. They're excited. And they're looking back at us saying, hey, you as a congregation, you as followers of Christ have given birth to us. Are you going to continue to teach us how to do it? Or are you going to grow complacent in where you're at? And then sometimes we hear excuses. Well, things will be better when the economy is better. Can I encourage you with this? Just because the economy has stalled, God hasn't. Yeah. Just because things are challenging around us, God is still at work. Just because the wrong person is elected, God is still at work. This is the life that Habakkuk lived in. Nothing went right for this guy. That's why nobody ever talks about him. It's not a very encouraging message. Nothing went right. But he still said it's important to remember what God has done. The final thing it's important to do is to wait. What do you do when you don't understand God's plan? We wait. Now, I don't like to wait. I do not like to wait. I mean, can't say enough negative things about waiting. I've switched, I don't know, probably a half dozen professional service providers in my life as a result of two lines being too long, which is very challenging in Odessa, right? It's very challenging here, especially when there's too many people for the professional services we have, right? And so, but it's so hard to wait. But Habakkuk says it's important. I want you to look what he wrote. He says, for the revelation awaits at an appointed time. It speaks of at the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. My least favorite 3 words. And it will certainly come and will not delay. Waiting is hard, especially now. Our culture is so geared around wanting things immediately, right? Waiting is really hard. You know what makes waiting a little better for me? Is when I'm not doing it alone. Like if I'm in the grocery store waiting in a long line to check out, and I've got my wife with me and we can talk about something, that's okay. It seems like the waiting is just a lot better then. If my wife's not with me and you're in front of me, I'm probably going to start talking to you because I talk to a brick wall. Right? You don't have to talk back. It's fine. I'll just keep talking. It makes me feel better, right? But when we wait alone, it's much harder. That's what I found in my life. When spiritually we're waiting on God alone, it's really hard. Man, it's hard. Maybe you're there right now and you're thinking, I can't wait anymore. I don't want to wait anymore. It's lonely when you're waiting alone. You know, God's not designed us to wait alone. In fact, at Crossroads, that's why we invest intentionally in small groups. We want people to wait in circles, not in lines. Get in a small group. Get in a group of people that you don't have to wait alone anymore. Wait in a circle with people. And sometimes they help talk you off the cliff, right? Mine does. They're very experienced. So get in a group that you don't have to wait alone. And it's important not only while we wait to trust what God will do. Trust what God will do, because God's not done. He says in chapter 3, going back towards the end of his book, he says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nations invading us. I know, God, what you're about to do. You're about to blow us up with some like wooden swords and plastic knives, because that's the kind of technology they had back then, right? And it's going to be a bummer. He says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes in the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there's no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls, I will rejoice in the Lord. I'll be joyful in God, my Savior. A modern version, he says, okay, God, I wait on you. I'll understand you're saying it's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable. And maybe even embarrassing. And even though the economy isn't what I want it to be, even though the jobs aren't plentiful, even though my kids and family are barely holding it together, even though my spouse and I can't seem to get along, even though I experience loneliness because you haven't provided what I want, even though nothing seems stable in my life, I'm going to trust you. I'll worship you and be joyful in what you've given me. Habakkuk goes on this journey from being frustrated with God to realizing that we don't get to decide God's plans. We simply discover them. Duke, our executive student pastor, a few weeks ago, talked about how if we don't have a plan, he said if someone isn't laughing at our plan, then it's not a big enough God-sized plan. And so if you have a plan for your life that you think is from God and you can do it on your own, it's not from God. I'll tell you that right now. We're going to talk more about that next week and what God's plan is for your life. But many of us don't want that vision of a bigger plan because then we're forced to trust God. And so we often end up wanting God to cram his giant plan into our lives, right? Into our puny little minds, instead of trusting him one step at a time, whether we listen or we wait and write and trust that God is going to take us there. So I want to encourage you this morning as we close to embrace the tension in your life. You know, God rarely works in the results. He almost always works in the tension. If you're going through a difficult time, a difficult experience, God wants to work in you and through that. When we wish that to be away and gone, off goes many times our opportunity for growth. And so embrace the tension. Find your rampart. Find where it is that you can hear from God and trust that God has a better plan for your life than anything that you could possibly imagine. Would you pray with me? Father, we're grateful for your love and grace. We're grateful that you have plans for our life. We're grateful that as Jeremiah, another prophet in the Old Testament, taught us, you have a plan that gives us hope and a future. Give us the courage to trust you, to take steps of faith towards whatever that plan is, to be action-oriented, even when we don't see the big picture, to take little steps, knowing that you'll reveal the rest along the way. For those who have maybe never accepted Christ into your life, I want to encourage you. Choose that plan today to come and find God. And our pastors will be down front. They would love to talk with you. So, Father, I pray for those who may be far from Christ today, that you give them an opportunity, that you would compel them to come and meet you. Give us uncommon courage that we can live lives that are pleasing to you. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.